Mr. Eli Gold. Eli, how are you, man?
I am well, Aaron. Good to see you.
Good to see you. You know, I actually did an article in the Tuscaloosa News about you when you went into the Hall.
Yes, sir.
The Hall of Fame. And one of the things I thought was really cool is you grew up, you're from New York, Brooklyn.
Yes.
And how you kind of traded places with Mel Allen, who's
Exactly.
a legendary broadcaster. And he ended up going to New York and having a broadcaster. I always thought the parallels there were interesting.
And he and I found that interesting. I was very, very blessed to have met him many times and talked with him. And I found out that he was a former voice of the Crimson Tide back in his youth. But yes, he and his broadcasting partner, Red Barber, who was from Columbus, Mississippi, before settling eventually in Tallahassee years later. But here were two Southern guys who moved to the North to broadcast for a franchise that was so northern they called them the Yankees. And I listened to them on my transistor radio. And for you youngsters listening in, if you don't know what a transistor radio is, you can Google it. I'd listen to them in bed call Yankee games. And then, as you say, now umpteen years later, I became the voice of the Tide and then worked for 41 years with NASCAR. And it's weird how life goes. And yes, Mel and I talked many times about the opposite yet somewhat similar paths of our career. So obviously he, excelled doing what he did, but it was great talking with him. It was.
Yeah. I don't know that I've ever asked you this. How did the Alabama opportunity come about? I mean,
it's one of the strangest stories, Aaron. I never applied for the job. I'm serious. I never applied. There was no agent. There were no back channel I didn't have Jimmy Sexton in another room doing something. There was no Jimmy Sexton. Bottom line was I was doing baseball in the Detroit Tigers organization. I was out of town, and a story broke in the papers that Paul Kennedy, who was doing the games at the time, was not going to be rehired when his contract expired. And my wife read it to me over the phone. Again, I was on the road doing baseball. And I said, well, that's unfortunate. Paul's a nice guy. But, life. I never applied, though, because I was a guy from New York City with no real contacts at the university. I was a pro sports guy. There was no reason. I knew that there was somebody internally or closer to the program who was going to get the job. Well, over the next number of weeks, the newspaper articles continued, and it said, such and such. Tommy Limbaugh was the gentleman who was empowered by Steve Sloan, who was the AD, to do the search. And it kept saying, among those on the list of possibilities, yada, 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 and Eli Gold. And then a few weeks later it said, those on the short list are yada, 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 and Eli Gold. And then one Friday, a newspaper article came out, and it said, those coming in for an interview are such and such, and Eli Gold.
And you'd still never been contacted?
Aaron, I had never been contacted. I hadn't contacted anyone. And as I stressed, there was no back channel, nothing. I mean, there was nothing. Well, I picked up the phone, and it was a great opening line because I didn't know Tommy Limbaugh from Adam's House Cat. I didn't know who he was. And I called, and I got through to him, and I said, Mr. Limbaugh, I said, you don't know me. I said, my name is Eli Gold, and I understand I'm coming in for an interview. And we both started laughing. That's exactly how it happened. And I did go down for an interview, and Wimp Sanderson, as it turned out, was in my corner. He had been encouraging them to talk to me. He had heard me do some work on the air. He said, this guy is good. Bring him in, talk to him. So that's where it started, what I didn't know. I didn't know that. So I go to that meeting in Limbaugh's office with Bill Curry, Wimp Sanderson, and Mr. Limbaugh, and had the meeting before I had driven back to Birmingham. So, 45, 50 minutes. I had a message at home. This is before cell phones.
Right.
I had a message at home, and my wife said, Mr. Limbaugh called, call him back. And I was given the basketball job. And folks may not remember, I did hoops in 88, 89. They brought John Forney back, who Ray Perkins had dismissed. John had done 29 years before Ray Perkins. They brought John back to do his 30th year. and I did the hoops. And then after that 88 football season, I was doing basketball 88, 89. John did the 88 football season. After that season, they offered me the football job. To this day, I have never applied for the job.
That's awesome.
Until I went down to Mr. Limbaugh's office. But, Wimp was pushing for me, and I was doing sports talk in Birmingham at the time. I was doing hockey. I was doing baseball. I was doing NASCAR. So I had my name out there, but I didn't know a soul at the university, and that's how it happened.
And so this year will be your
30th year with the network, 29th doing football.
That's awesome. To this day, do you know how do you believe it was Wimp that was whispering in Alabama's ear?
I believe it was at that point, yeah, because I had Alabama people on my radio talk show, but that's not knowing them per se,
right.
But Wimp, as it turns out, was the guy who pushed, and then once I got the basketball job, they asked for a football tape, and I had not done much, but I was doing freelance stuff. I had done what was called the Tangerine Bowl at the time in Orlando, and I had done that. My color man was Lee Corso, interestingly.
Wow.
And we had done their network broadcast. So I had a tape, and I submitted it, and I guess somebody in a weak moment said, let's hire him. And it was not universally accepted at all. It was, more and more people thought it was a terrible hire. And I just said, look, you're welcome to your thoughts. At least wait till I open my mouth. If you don't like it, then feel free. Write to whoever you want to. But let me at least open my mouth. And I'll never forget doing that first game against Memphis State, as it was called then, back in '89. And, man, I was shaking uncontrollably before that game. It was at Legion Field, and I got there early. I didn't want to get caught in traffic, and that was a mistake. I got there so early, I was sitting in the booth just trembling, literally trembling. And thank God, here we are 30 years later.
And quite a memorable season. Alabama won the SEC championship that year. Talking to Eli Gold, the voice of Alabama football and CTSN broadcast, also a State of Alabama Broadcasting Hall of Fame member. What's it like? To a lot of people, they've grown up in your Alabama football to them. So I'm sure it feels like they know you, and I'm sure you get approached all the time. What's it like living a very public life?
It's fine. It's an honor. People always say, folks will come up to us while we're having dinner. Hate to bother you, but can we get a picture? Can you sign this? And I'll be with, my wife is used to it, but I will be with friends or something, and they'll say, man, doesn't that just bother the crap out of you? And I'll say, no. I said, when they stop coming up to you, that's when you have a problem. Yeah. And it's true. When they stop, for folks to be so comfortable to come up and want to see you, want to talk to you, want a picture, want an autograph, just shoot the breeze, whatever, that is the greatest tribute that you can get. Folks, a lot of people don't realize if they're not in the line of work, those are the people I work for. They may not physically sign my check, but the listening audience are the people I work for. So, no, if they come up to me, I will never turn down a request for a picture. I will always drop what I'm doing. I view it as an honor, more so than any kind of an interference or bother.
Yeah.
When it stops, man, that's when you have problems.
That's right. Wrapping up here with Eli Gold, man, I wish I could ask you a million questions, but
I've got time if you got the time.
You were a fascinating resource for me on a story I told about Kenny Stabler, and we just recently remembered the second anniversary of his passing.
And did you see the NFL Films tribute
piece? It was amazing.
I'm not going to lie to you. I had tears coming out of my eyes. Yes, I watched it yesterday, and I said, my goodness, good thing nobody's here in the room with me because I was boo-hooing.
Yeah.
It was so wonderful to see.
What do you miss about him?
So much. He was a dear friend. You never knew what he was going to say. Again, he and Phil Savage, my current color man, they looked at the game totally differently.
Right.
But both were geniuses. Kenny looked at it as a quarterback who's been there and done that. Phil looks at it as a GM type, But Kenny was just so intelligent. He made me such a better broadcaster. He would point stuff out. his preparation was different than some folks. Did he walk in with a sheet full of papers and notes like Phil does? No. But each game, Kenny's diagramming the plays, and he's talking about this. And people don't realize how difficult it is to be a great color man, because a color man is normally a football savant.
Right.
They know the game far better than we'll ever know it. And for them to, and I hate to use the term dumb it down, but for them to bring it down to a level that we normal folks can understand, analyze what they're seeing, say it in 12 seconds, if that much, before turning it back to the play-by-play guy to set up the next play, that is tough to do.
Yeah.
And Snake could do that. Now, when he was talking about Salim Rashid and he called him Abdul Salam, we laughed because we knew who he was talking about. When he would say, man, what a great play by Abdul Aziz, and there's nobody on the field by that name, but you knew he meant, Salim Rashid, and everybody, that's Snake.
Yeah.
When we played the games at Hawaii, I mean, what he did to those Hawaiian names shouldn't be heard by anybody. But we knew who he was talking about. But Snake was he was an everyday guy.
Yeah.
And there's another man who never turned down an autograph, never turned down a request for a picture. It would take us a half hour to get out of an airport where it should have taken you 6 or 7 minutes, because everybody, Bama fan, Texans fan, didn't matter who it was, they all wanted a piece of Snake. So a great, great guy, but he was omniscient. He knew it. He said to me constantly, I'd always commiserate with him. I said, man, I hate to see you're not on the list for the Hall of Fame. You're not on the list. You're not on the list. Every year. And he'd say, I'm telling you, big guy. He said, I ain't never going to get in there till I'm dead. I said, why? He goes, and he'd say, those guys ain't going to vote me in, I'm telling you. And no sooner did he pass away, I mean, the body was still warm, and the gates to Canton were opening up. So he knew, but he was a great guy, and we still talk about him lovingly.
One more question before I let you get out of here.
Sure.
You've worked with different coaches with different personalities, and I know because I work with them, but for the everyday fan, how much of a challenge is it to work with Nick Saban, or is it for you?
It's different, but different doesn't make it wrong.
Right.
Different makes it different. Nick Saban is the only coach, when we tape our pregame show, for whom I have formulated questions in my mind. I know what I need and want to ask him and how I'm going to phrase it so I don't say
that's
something.
Key.
That's key.
Yeah.
That is key. Mike Shula, all the way back to Gene Stallings, you'd sit down, you'd shoot the breeze for a half hour, then you'd say, hey, let's turn on the tape recorder, and you'd bang out the pregame show, then you'd turn it off, and you'd sit around and shoot the breeze for another half hour, and you don't do that with Coach Saban. But, I think he respects me. I respect him, certainly. We are much better now than we were when he first showed up. We virtually never talked. Now we don't talk a ton.
Right.
But, I'll every now and then get a smile out of him. And when Tom Roberts retired, taking over the hosting of the Nick Saban show has helped me know him even more and his style and so on. So, I love working with him. The guys, what the fans see from behind the podium in those 30-second sound bites, that is and is not the real Nick Saban. He uses his podium as a way to disseminate messages to the players and to others. But I love working with him. And, I'll ask him sometimes, I say, hey, explain this to me. I said, you're above me here.
Yeah.
Explain this to me. And he will. So, we get along great. But do I sit around and tell jokes and shoot the breeze with him like I did with – we sat one day in Columbus, Mississippi with Gene Stallings on a Friday night taping the pregame show. And Coach Stallings had told me the week prior, he goes, hey, bring your blueprints next. I was building a house. He was building a house in Paris, Texas. Now, of course, his house looks like the Marriott. My house looked like a little cottage out behind his house. We're on our hands and knees on the floor of the Holiday Inn in Columbus, Mississippi, going over blueprints. And he says, you ought to have an electric outlet right here. And I mean, you'd never do that with Coach Saban. They're different people. But I love working with Coach Saban. He's a genius, and you know I've learned a lot. I mean, I'm not embarrassed to say I have. If you don't learn from that man, you're making a mistake personally, because the man can teach you a lot, not only about football but about life. And I enjoy working with him.
He's a broadcasting legend, Mr. Eli Gold, the voice of Alabama football on CTSN broadcast. Also a Hall of Famer. Eli, I can't thank you enough, and we can't wait to hear you
Well, thank
September 2nd in Atlanta.
It's almost that time, Aaron. Good to see you.
Thanks
Keep
for
up the
joining
good
us.
work on the show.
Appreciate it.
All right.